Welcome to Living in Harmony, a podcast for Christian parents who want to make the peace in their household without sacrificing their sanity. Here, we talk about everything from sibling rivalry to dating and how to raise your kids to be strong in their faith while maintaining your own. But don't worry, we're not all preachy here. That's the purpose of your church and your pastor. Here, we're here for you, to help you know you are not alone in this crazy journey called parenthood. So whether you're a seasoned pro or a brand new parent, Living in Harmony, this is the podcast for you. So grab some coffee or wine, we won't judge, and join us as we navigate the ups and downs of raising kids in a Christian household where the gospel is the center. Well, welcome back to Living in Harmony. We hope wherever you are, whatever you've been doing, you've been having a good day. My name's Delmar.
I am Robert.
And I'm April.
And our job here is to just come alongside of you. At the end of the day, this entire podcast is about parents. And we are not your children's parents, you are. But our hope is that we can be an encouragement to you. And before we started recording today, we were talking about what do you call what we have to talk about today? And we've got a couple ideas about that. But before we get to that, I just want to know what you get into this week in your own homes.
This week, I was traveling. I was actually in Arizona for work. And interestingly enough, it snowed while we were there. And they closed the office where I was working. So we got a snow day. Got to sit and watch the 2 inches of snow as it promptly melted off by noon. But yeah, it was interesting. You know, living in South Carolina, I don't see snow that often, although I've seen it before. But it was kind of fun.
Nice snow day with no family. Snow and family makes snow better.
It absolutely does.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was talking to April on the phone, and she says, "You gonna go play in the snow?" I'm like, "No, not really, because it's not really a thing."
If you could throw a snowball in your child's face.
Oh, absolutely, would do that all the time.
What about you, April?
Well, let's see. So he was off for his work trip. I was at home, working, doing things around the house, and apparently, unbeknownst to myself, sitting around while our both of our freezers in our garage
This is a sad story.
got turned off.
Oh no!
Yeah, we found that out this weekend. So yeah, we have 2 full freezers full of
Spoiled food now.
food that has to get thrown out. So that's going to be our project. And, oh no. By the time it was discovered, it was too late. So that's kind of what was going on later this week.
Yeah, that's a very sad thing. The good news is we caught it before it like rotted, so it doesn't smell super bad.
That's good.
But the bad news is we didn't catch it in time to salvage pretty much anything. It all defrosted. Very sad.
2 freezers full of meat.
Hey, sometimes what happens in your family this week isn't joyful.
No.
That is a true statement. This week,
But you know what? I chose to see positive in it, and I told Robert, I said, at least now we'll have our freezers defrosted. We can wipe them down, reload it, start over.
Small consolation, but some positive.
Silver lining.
Yeah.
This week would have been my grandmother's birthday. She passed away. This is her first, birthday away from us. And so what we did is my mother and her brothers and sisters decided they wanted to throw kind of like a birthday party for Nanny at my papa's. So yesterday I grabbed the kids. Hannah stayed here. She had to take care of some stuff at the home. And we went to Papa's house and we were able to eat her catfish stew, which April says she's never had. So I'm going to have to make it. Is so good. We had catfish stew and then fried bass and brim. It was so good.
So I have had that.
Yeah.
The fry.
So it's so funny because today we just got done with church and I text my wife. I brought her a plate home. I said, "Hey, you can have that for lunch today if you want it." And she goes, "Oh, I looked at it. That doesn't really seem like me," which is her nice way of putting there's country food and then there's what you brought home.
Right.
So I said, "Good. I know what I'm having for lunch today. So give me the catfish stew and some rice and I'm good to go." But anyways, it was really nice. We went out to graveside and put a couple balloons in the air and kind of got to be with Papa. That was a tough moment. I can't imagine 60 something years married and then that, but it's one of those things. Not every week's a good week. Not every week's a bad week, but sometimes it's kind of a mixture. And
Right.
I think yesterday was a mixture because, my little boys were there beside the grave and they're like, "Where's Nanny?" Well, this is her first official birthday in the presence of her creator, like physically. It's pretty, I don't know how all that works, but on this side of eternity, it's a pretty cool thought. So As we get into today's content, let's go ahead and let's roll into what's in the culture. So we debated on what to call this, and we kind of landed on this as National Lampoon's Go to Church. Because if you've seen any of the Go on Vacation or Christmas, you know that it's all Chevy Chase has this grand idea about what it's going to be, and then reality sets in. And do you remember the one episode where he drugged the movie where they drugged the dog behind the car? Did you see that one? They chained up the dog. They were at a restroom stop, and they got down the road, and the cop pulls them, and evidently they chained their dog up behind the car. And they had this beautiful idea. This would be a great vacation. And they ended up killing their dog and crashing their car. And the reason we chose that is because I think as parents, especially when your kids are younger, you have this idea. We're church folk. We go to church. We're Christians. We have these values. And we are just going to ride down the road and instill them into our kids. And then they're going to be these mighty church warriors. And then you find out they have their own little personalities. And they have their own strengths and their own failurs.
Turns out our children are fallen too. How about that?
Gosh, what's this original sin thing? No one told me about that. But yeah, 100%. So today what we're really talking about at its core is how do we get our children engaged in church beyond the level of, oh, I took them. Because if you take somebody, I can take my kid to a place long enough. It doesn't mean there's transformative value in it if they're not really getting it. So I'm sure that both of you have witnessed this.
Yeah.
So before we got to any of our pointers, I mean, you guys' story, your children have all, by the grace of God, remained engaged in their faith and in church. And was there a point in your two relationship where you had to conversate, like, what does this look like? How far are we going to go with this? Where are the breaks? Any of that stuff?
Well, we started, I mean, what you said, you can't just show up and take them, but that's kind of where you have to start. And so we had always known, as a family, as a married couple, we were Christ followers when we got married. We have always intended to raise our family that way. So for us, it was, that was just the next step, right? It's what we did. And so, we didn't really have to talk about whether or not we would. It was just how do we execute this plan?
That's good. What about you, April? Any bringing your kids to church, did you ever have any seasons where it was more difficult than others and you're just like, we just got to do it, or?
I don't think so. I mean, I think our kids always, that's what they've known since birth. I think, I mean, this isn't really what you meant, but as far as difficulties, I would say the most difficult time was honestly when our daughter was a baby and a toddler, because she, so we found out years later, she's introverted, right? She's an introvert. Right. She also didn't like being left with people that were strangers or not us. And me being an extrovert, I didn't really have an understanding of that yet. But she was the baby that cried every Sunday. And that's not an exaggeration. Sunday. Like, if you think I'm talking in generalities saying every, but it was every. We would get paged every week because she was crying to the point of not being consoled in the nursery. And, there were some times where I probably spent, I don't know how many months not hearing a sermon because I had her out. I would have to go pick her up from the nursery and go take her out, in the, kind of lobby area and things like that. And finally, I just kind of talked with the nursery people and said, if you will just let me in there and just stay with her for a little bit, then she'll learn that she can calm down and maybe look around and realize it's okay being here. But that was the only time really where we had a struggle with a kid, and it was just something like that. But she got past it. So,
and I think, there's so many different varieties of parents. Both of y'all are lockstep with the Lord. So you had this agreement. I know for me in my house growing up, my dad was not a believer till I was 15. So those first 14 years, he was, what you call a rope burn victim. They drug him to church. He was the dog behind the car, so to speak. And I remember specifically, it was a Sunday night. My mom was going to church, and looking back at this now, I can imagine how this hit as a parent. But I looked at her and I said, "Well, Dad doesn't go. I don't want to go." And I remember her saying, "Oh," and she just walked out the house. And now, as a parent, I can imagine how my mom felt driving to church that night. Now, very graciously, God saved my dad. And now, he was at church longer than I was last week during the services. For all of them, even Sunday nights, and I've seen that transformation. But I guess what I'm trying to say is everybody's story is unique, and not all parents are on board with it. Some parents have a different opinion on how you should approach it. And we're going to try to talk about a few of those things. And if you're a note taker, or if you're a rememberer, there's a few things we just want to submit that would help this conversation in your family and help create an environment that gives your children not just permission, but hopefully more of a desire to be amongst believers, because we know the value of your child being around other adults who have the same morals and principles and beliefs as us and worldview. Because if not, it's easy for our kids to be like, "Well, that's just my parents." And then they go to college and they're like, "Well, no one else believed this." Right. But if they're from an established community with hundreds of believers maybe, then when they see opinions other than the world, they know there's a large base of other people. So that kind of brings us to our first point, and it's going to sound simple, but man, I think it's so hard, right? And that is this one. First thing, when it comes to wanting our children to get engaged in church, is that we need to lead by example as parents. So when I strike that, there's a few thoughts behind that, but just how does that hit you in the vein of this conversation?
No, I think that's kind of where you started a minute ago. You can't just take them, but you have to take them, right? You have to go, and you have to make it a habit as a family that this is something we do every weekend. We go spend time in worship. We spend time learning about what God wants us to do and how He wants us to be. We spend time learning about who we are in His sight and how that affects how we live. And when you just lead that example, and it's not just by going and showing up, it's also and I think we'll dive into this a little bit deeper later, but it's also about the application, the learning. So when you take your faith seriously as a parent, when you take your faith seriously as an adult, then that helps the kids to know, oh, this is something important. Just like it is if you eat well, or just like if you exercise, or just like if you wash the dishes every night and do those things. Those are things that it's easier to tell the lesson, to teach the lesson when you're also doing the action yourself.
Yeah, well, and I think that's key because, we're all familiar with the phrase, do what I say, not what I do. And it doesn't work. And it doesn't work with raising kids either. And so I think that if we have an expectation of what we want our kids to be participating in, as far as, looking at church not as a thing that you do if you feel like it, but as something that, you do because we are followers of Christ, then yes, we lead by example, and we are able to say, follow me and do what I do, instead of, I know this is what I do, but do what I'm saying.
Yeah. And because there's I think a lot of us, it's easy to be like, well, I don't want to just throw that out there and then they have to just follow it. But, sometimes you give an example, this is why you should follow it, but sometimes they can't comprehend it because they're not there, that they haven't lived it. Does that mean we shouldn't try in our own way to explain it? No, but it's kind of like touching this stove. I tell my child, don't touch it. Why? Because it's hot. It doesn't look hot. It doesn't smell hot. Listen, it's hot. You don't understand. You touch it, you're going to get burned. They don't understand it sometimes. They don't see fire, so what do? They touch it. So what I tell them is like, listen, you don't need a reason. Just don't do it. And the problem is when I don't give them any reason, they touch it, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So I got to try to help explain as best I can understanding, sometimes they may not understand the full reason why they need to be in service. And that's why leading by example is so important. Listen, your kids need to see you go to church sometime when you don't want to. Mm-hmm. Like, your kids need to know that you don't want to go today, and then they need to watch you go, right? You just got back from vacation. You drove from Florida yesterday. It's been 8 hours. You got home at 9 last night on a Saturday. What's our first inkling?
Sleep.
When your kids know we're getting up and going to church, like, you're not having to explain it. You're doing it. You know, let your kids see you being in a small group. Like, we are in a small group on Tuesdays.
Right.
My children know every single Tuesday night, mom and dad are leaving home, or someone's coming to our house to watch them. And they say, y'all have Bible study tonight. They know that. So they know this is a core value in our family. You know, so even as much as I'm getting by attending it, they're getting it just by knowing we're attending.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's real important when it comes to leading by example. It's not just forcing your kids. It's you saying, watch me. I'm going to be involved in it. So that's one encouragement here. If you want your children to be involved, then you need to lead by that example. I had someone one time, and her children both played softball. And she said, well, when they were younger, they were doing dance, right? And I remember she didn't bring her kids to church because they were dancing. And her thing was, she told me, well, there's only a short season where they're going to dance. Then they found softball in high school, travel ball, which is like its own religion. It can be, right?
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
So anything can be an own religion. But I remember her saying, well, they're not going to be professional softball players. This is only the season they can do it in. So we're going to have to miss virtually everything for this sport. And now she's wondering, why won't my kids get involved in church? Because they're on their own now. It's like they're thinking one day there'll be a season for that. And what we want to instill in our kids is not a season for being in worship.
It's a lifestyle.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it's just it's part of what you do.
Yeah, I mean, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul's telling the Corinthians there, he's like, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. And,
Yes.
I heard a long time ago, you know, I think he was a youth leader said that to me. It's like, what higher call could you say is to just be like me, right? And that's we see that in coaches and fitness trainers and other things like that. I mean, you don't want to go, learn basketball from someone who's never played basketball before. You'd much rather learn from an NBA All-Star, right? Because that's the person who can show you. And in the same way, if we're trying to teach our kids these spiritual truths, what better way than to say, do what I'm doing, which is not always the same as saying do what I always have done, because we've all got those things in our past, and sometimes those are life lessons that we can point back to and say, hey, I did this wrong when I was your age, and I know I did this wrong, and here was the consequence of that. So and I think it's difficult for us sometimes to own that and to say, oh, you know what, I didn't behave in whatever way appropriately when I was 16, so therefore it's unfair of me to ask my 16-year-old to do that. It's like, well, no, maybe you did something stupid when you were 16, and now you need to say, don't be dumb like I was dumb.
Yeah, and leading by example is often a path of humility, right?
Yes.
And it's knowing what values you have in a family. I know another family, their daughter played travel ball, and sometimes they had tournaments on Sunday, and the father was one of the coaches. And he said, listen, if we're playing on a Sunday, I'm going to tell you what, we're going to be in church. So they would drive to town and they would find sometimes a church. Or if they had a game, he would say, all right, before you even leave this hotel, meet in the lobby. We're going to have a devotion. We're going to pray together. We might sing. He made sure that practice, even though they couldn't be with their own church families that week, that the practice was still there. Mm-hmm. And to me, that is such a wonderful way to lead by example, because it's saying, listen, we'll make it work. That's the example. So another thing, a second thing we'd say, if you want to create a culture that would foster your children going to church, this one, of course, requires you to be involved. But it's this: you need to make church fun. I think some churches think that the kids should just sit there and be quiet, but I worked with Young Life for about 6 years, and there's a bigger conversation about Young Life, but I will say this: the guy who created it had a great quote. He said, "It's a sin to bore the kids with the gospel." I'm like, man, yeah. And when I think about make church fun, what we're not saying is make it a joke. Those are two different things.
Right.
And we're not saying make it just entertainment, a form of entertainment.
Yes, because that's not necessarily what fun is. Have y'all ever seen? How are some times y'all have seen where church was fun in a biblical way?
Oh, every Sunday.
That's true. That's
I don't
true.
know. I think with the right mindset, it is fun. And when you think about, it's, it's a celebration. It's a time for us as believers to come together and, worship together. And, sermons are great. And it's just like it's like a family reunion every week, so.
And that hasn't been true at every point in our lives as we've moved around in the military and different places. Not every place we've been we could point to and say, hey, this is going to be a fun sermon. How many movie quotes is the pastor going to put in there, this week? So sometimes it's been other things, but I think one of the things that's important is to when you have small children, make sure that the programs are engaging and make sure that you kind of get to know who those leaders are and figure out what's going on in those rooms, and don't just expect that when you drop your kids off that they are learning or enjoying. Talk to your kids about what's going on. Have those conversations. And this kind of leads into another point that we'll come back to later. But have those conversations with your kids when you're driving home from church. What was it that you guys learned today? Maybe in the sermon, maybe in your Sunday school room or your group room or wherever the kids are. What did you learn, and how can we make that work?
Yeah, and the way you're able to unpack that itself is you're carrying on what happened in church. You're showing this isn't an isolated thing. This is a part of our life. In that same vein of keeping it fun, here we go. I'm going to share it. Some parents may not think this is fun, okay? But this is part of our job to make it fun. If you want to make sure that church is an atmosphere that invites your child to draw into the Lord, and one of the best ways to do that, you ready? Serve in the kids department. Specifically, if you have a child in the children, like, drop in. Hey, I will step into the nursery once a month. And this is why this is important. You're going to be able to know if those kids are being fed spiritually. And also, and I'm speaking as somebody on staff at a church, you're going to be able to give valuable feedback that sometimes staff may not see. Right? Like if I'm leading kids ministry and, for example, my leaders are frazzled, I'm like, why? Well, we don't have a schedule and we don't have the supplies we need. Well, then we're not helping that environment. So one of the things you can do as a parent is get involved in the programs your kids are in. Some parents are like, well, my kid doesn't want to be around me because he's in high school. You know what? Talk to your student pastor. Talk to your lead pastor about it if you don't have a student pastor. But how can you get involved? Because that's how you're going to be able to see if your child's getting engaged. We have a rather introverted student ministry, which I actually think is really cool. It's a gift we've been given. I have quite a few parents who come, and it's so helpful because the student will sit by themselves, and I'm sitting there going, oh no, are they having the worst day of their life? And their dad's like, no, that means my kid's enjoying it. Because if he wasn't enjoying it, he'd be fidgeting, he'd be hanging out with me. So it's very helpful. If you want to help church be an engaging place for your kids, go be where your kids are, and then in the most appropriate way you can, provide feedback.
And that doesn't always mean that you have to be in the same room with
Absolutely
your kid.
not.
So if it's one of those situations where it's like, yeah, my kid sort of misbehaves when I'm in the room, that happens I think it happens to everybody sometimes and to some people all the time. Maybe it's okay, I'll work in the classroom next door, or I'll help out someplace else where I can be around and I can sort of see it. But, and so I get to understand that. And honestly, it is fun. And I'm not a person who I always loved hanging out with my own kids. I didn't always love hanging out with other people's kids. I'm just kind of like that. At least
Especially
when they're
like the little ones.
yeah, when they're little. But there's something really entertaining about watching, a group of 6-year-olds playing and doing things.
yeah.
I mean, it's just, detaching yourself and just watching them enjoy running in circles. That's more of a 3 or 4-year-old thing, but just watching them run in circles and giggle is it's just really enjoyable sometimes.
Well, let me ask you this. Did either of you learn how to swim the way I was? The way I learned how to swim, my birthday, my aunt, we went into the deep end. She was holding me. She goes, "I'm going to stop holding you now." And she just let go. Like, that's how I learned. And it was terrifying. But I learned how to swim on my birthday because of my Aunt Vicky. And that was not fun the first 20 seconds, when I feel like but what she did is she helped me see, listen, just trust. I'm going to bring you here. I'm dropping you off. Just trust. It's like my little girl. Yesterday, my aunt makes this stuff called chocolate eclair. It's amazing. Okay.
Sounds amazing.
They will have it in heaven. I am convinced. And Nora, my little girl, comes up and it looks like chocolate vanilla pudding, but it's way more than that. And I put some on a spoon. She goes, because she looked at it. She didn't like the way it looks. I just touched her lips with it. And then she licked her lips. She ate the rest of my chocolate eclair almost because it was awesome. But it's like sometimes the way your children receive things they need is, parent, you got to give them that taste. They don't even know.
That was true for us with with vegetables. And strangely enough, I mean, and so we always had, we always just ate vegetables of various things, and we tried to make them good, and that didn't always mean drown it in cheese. And so, as they got older, that was just something that they would get to a point where there were certain things they wouldn't eat. And one of our kids, whom I will not name, has a bigger problem with eating vegetables than the other two. But it's still a thing that, but that's good for you. And there's a thing about, spiritual vegetables. Sometimes you have to start that, and you have to say, okay, we're going to go do this thing, and maybe we'll do the thing together for a little bit. And then, you'll find your own way, to enjoy it yourself.
But okay, so you said something interesting there that I just thought I might,
well, everything I say is interesting. So there's that.
So, when you talked about our kids and vegetables, and I'm thinking back to when they were young, and it is true, our kids were really good veggie eaters. And sometimes people would ask, how did you get them to you're talking toddlers and stuff that would eat all kinds of vegetables. And my response was, well, when they were, babies and starting to eat solid foods, that's what we gave them. And there was no option. It wasn't like, well, should we give them the cookies today or should we give them the veggies? And so if they wanted food, they ate, the veggies and other stuff. But that's what they knew.
Right.
And did they get to have eventually cookies and other things? Well, I mean, eventually, sure. But there was a good solid foundation for, especially with our older kids, years. Our younger kid, of course, youngest, ended up, as my older two kids have told us, apparently he was able to start having cookies and stuff earlier than the other two had. But, I'm like, well, that's what happens with the youngest kid. And you guys are going to drive before him, so be quiet. But anyway, the point is that they all had this foundation of that was the expectation. That's what was given. That was what was offered. And that's what they had. And so to them, eating all these different veggies was normal.
It was fun.
Yeah.
See, fun should be baseline, right? Like when we say fun, like you said, it's not entertainment. We're talking about just something I enjoy being at. And which brings us to our next one is when it comes to creating that atmosphere, serve with your children in church. Right? Serve in if your church is going and feeding at a food shelter, go with them. If your church is going on a mission trip, go with them. It is okay to tell your youth program at the church, my child cannot come to this function because we are serving here in the church. Your youth person or child person may not be okay with it, but it's the right thing. We have a couple students, sometimes they don't go to what we call our connection group on Sunday morning because they're teaching children's church to our young kids under their mother who helps head up that children's department. That's good. these students are learning there's so much more in the bigger scope. So get involved with your children serving, and not necessarily in their same age category. Let them break out. They say it takes an average of 4 to 5 solid relationships that a child must have with another adult outside of their parents and staff at the church to keep them in the church, so they have that relational strength. So get involved, serve. If there's missions, go on missions. But find out where you can. And if there's not a place, well, then that's where you have a conversation with somebody. Or maybe that's God calling you to create that place.
Right. Mm-hmm. And I think something else that's important about serving, somewhere in the church is that I think kids need to understand there's more to church than just the children's department or just the youth ministry. And, those things are okay, but they need to have the ability to form an understanding and a pattern and a lifestyle of there's more to church than just I show up to youth ministry, or I get dropped off for children's this or that, and that's church. And so that's serving together in other capacities, and having them, I think it helps them recognize a broader picture than just what's in it for me.
And I think that also would help them to stay engaged as kids transition from junior high to high school, especially high school out into to beyond that, whether it's college or something else, that you have if they understand that there are other places for them to be involved, then they understand I'm not in student ministry anymore. I'm not doing this thing with just my peers anymore. Oh, but there's still something here for me. It doesn't just evaporate. I know that's a problem culturally, at least in the United States right now, that tends to happen. You tend to have these kids who are really strong in high school, and then they graduate and they don't transition very well. And I think keeping them involved in other places, even from younger ages, from very young ages, keeping them involved in other things, it helps them to understand that church is about more than just that youth program.
Yeah, and that's why it's very important to have cross-generational opportunity in your church. Mm-hmm. Even in our student ministry right now, quite a lot of parents come because I want the students to know this is a larger thing than what's going on. So we've got one more kind of big point and then one big thought, and then we're going to move on to what we talked about in church today, because that was very good. I keep saying that every week. When they stink, we promise we'll tell you. But Dan, the Lord is using him. He is crushing it. But real quick, one more thing we want to go ahead and say is I grew up cutting grass with Dad, and we would have hedges. And I hate cutting hedges. I hate it because you're just sweating. You're throwing a hedger, and like, oh man. But like when you get done, you step back and look at it, you're like, this is it. This is the shape they're supposed to be in. And it's the same way with our children. Sometimes our children, if we're doing these things well, and if things are going the way they should be, they are engaged in church. But it's real easy. If you've ever been in church and you serve, you know how easy it is to get sucked into doing everything. And I know quite a lot of parents, even you guys, have really in the past had some moments where your children were too stretched out and they were like hedges that were growing wild in front of the house. And you're like, this is going to be painful, but you're going to have to cut back on some of this, not because we don't want you involved in church, but because we want you to have the correct form in church and not be burnt out.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we had that. I think all of our kids at some point in time, either because they enjoyed the various things they were doing and said, I want to do that, I want to do that, I want to do that, or because they were asked to. They showed a talent or an aptitude in an area and were asked to participate in something. And sometimes that's what God uses to tell us what our areas of giftedness are. It's like, someone else comes out and says, you're really good at that. Have you considered ... And sometimes we need that kind of prompting. But sometimes that just happens so much, and we don't want to say no, and we don't understand how to put our put our boundaries on there. And I really like your illustration of a hedge, because in order to do that, you sort of have to know what the hedge is going to look like. I mean, you could make it square, you could make it sort of rounded, you could give it a different shape. And if you as the gardener, understand what it's supposed to be, because you know what that plant does, and you know what the purpose is supposed to be, whether it's being pretty, or whether it's security, or whether it's just screening visually. Those are different purposes, and you prune it differently for those purposes. And I think it's important for us to to acknowledge that God is our gardener, and he uses that illustration. Jesus used that illustration. We're not making that up, right? That he's going to prune us in certain ways, and we have to be willing to allow that.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think that it can be hard sometimes, because sometimes you're looking at things. If you have a child who is involved in a lot of things, at church, it can feel sometimes maybe wrong having to say, no, you're going to have to cut that part out, or that's something you need to take a break from, or you need to say no to that.
Because those are all good things, right?
Right, because they're good things. But just because something is a good thing, and something as a Christian that would be a good thing to be involved in, it doesn't mean that that's the right thing for you right now. And, that can be taken the wrong way, to where people use that as an excuse to not be involved at all. Right. And that's not what we're talking about. But, if you're, we've had situations in the past with our kids where we've had to sit down and say, look, all of these things, these are good things, but you're stretched too thin, or you're not able to do this and this area because you're so involved in this area. And so we need to sit down and think about a reasonable amount of commitment, so that, you can function and do the things you need to do, and do what God's calling you to do.
And talk about modeling. We've had to do that in our own lives. Yeah. We've been overextended. There's been a couple of times in our lives where one or the other of us has just been way overtaxed, and we allowed ourselves to get in there, and we had to pull back. And that's another thing, that modeling and having that discussion, and being honest about it is important.
Absolutely. And as someone who's been on the receiving end, mom, dad said we need to cut back on things. That hurt. It hurts, but you know what? Hurt your pastor for the glory of God to raise your kids. And I will say this now, this is one thing that you guys did especially well when your kids had to do it with me. You pulled me aside. You said, hey, Nathaniel's going to be talking to you. He's going to be stepping out, but we've had a conversation. And that's very helpful. And actually was like, okay, this makes sense. But one encouragement there is, I don't trim my hedges to punish them for growing. Mm-hmm. I trim them because I want them to grow, and I want them. So, I've seen parents are like, well, their grades are failing. I'm grounding them from church. You should probably ground them from a smartphone before church. Yeah. If we're going to be honest, which kind of brings to the last
video games.
Yeah. And then honestly, if your child is struggling with their grades, the church should be a place you can come to get help for that. Mm-hmm. There's people in your church who can tutor your kids and help. Which kind of brings to just a last little aside, because I want to make sure we give good stewardship to our other time. But as much as possible, I apply my house rules when it comes to church, in the sense that my kids, they don't get to decide when they are going to start driving their car. I get to decide when they get there restricted, and when we're going to go somewhere and what we're going to do. My kids don't get to decide necessarily where we go on vacation, because my kid might want to go, that doesn't mean we might not go somewhere they want to go, but it's our parents. It's our responsibility. And when it comes to just being in church, I think it's important to realize, as parents, we are the spiritual stewards of our families. Our children so many times can set the pace for our spiritual life, but we're supposed to be setting the pace for them. And the way I look at it is, so many parents are like, well, I don't want to force religion down my child's throat. I don't want to force God on them. And fair, okay? Fair. I get that heartbeat. But let me ask you this. For those of you who have kids who are driving, or if they're going to drive, when they get their license for the first time, are you like, well, you got your license, go figure it out on your own? No parent is going to say, I'm never going to ride with you and teach you the basics. I'm not going to teach you what good driving looks like. Good luck. But when it comes to instilling our faith, so many parents, we abdicate that on the sense of, well, we don't want to force this on our child. But listen, the good way. you know the best way. Why wouldn't you want to be in the driver's seat with
Exactly.
them?
Well, and why do we make that? Why do we make just that? Why do we only say that in that area? It's like, I'm not. Would you ever dream of someone saying, or would you expect or accept another parent to say, yeah, I'm not going to force math on my kids, when they're 6. I'm not going to force reading on my kids. I'm not going to force school on my kids. I'm going to let them decide if they want an education. I'm going to let them decide if they want to live indoors. I'm going to let them decide if they want to eat chocolate cake every day for breakfast. No, we don't do that. We make decisions for our children because those decisions are better for them in the long term. And we have the ability to see that because we've been there, right? We are wiser than they are. And our prefrontal cortexes are developed. Our brains are more developed, and we can see those long-term consequences in a way that they can't. And so I think it's, like you said, I understand the mindset of I'm not going to force religion on my kid, but we force a lot of things on our kids, and we should. We should be trying to encourage them. We should be trying to guide them into the truth, all the truths, all the things that are true, and whether that's math or whether that's, truth about Jesus. I mean, those are things we should be trying to do.
And there is some truth in that. You cannot force Christianity to your child. That is a relationship. That is a faith that's been gifted to them by the Lord. You can't force conversion. But we also know Scripture is very clear. Faith comes through hearing the word, hearing it proclaimed. If you're not getting them in an environment where they're not hearing the word, that is on you. That is on you, because you can't convert them, but you can put them in an opportunity where they can at least look at what's there. And now, okay, that's between them and the Lord. And that's just real clear that we draw that line. And I think that's some feet to the fire that even I myself need, right? Like we all need to have. I'm responsible for. I have to answer for that. Just like your child, I'm going to make sure my kid gets education. When he graduates high school, if he wants to continue it, that's him. Okay. If he wants to go in the military, wants to be a contractor, if he wants to, change oil in cars, cool. That's him. But our job is to get them there. And for our family, this is part of it. This is part of it because it's the way the Lord's got us. So, and sometimes, as we know, it doesn't work out. Right? Like we try to get our children involved in church. Sometimes, I heard one guy on the internet said, your children are the greatest source of joy and simultaneously your greatest source of heartache. And I don't know if you're a parent listening right now, some of you've experienced both of those. Some of you right now, you are in seasons of great joy. Your child's accomplishing a lot, in your worldview. Some of us are in here like, I don't know what happened, or I don't know what's happening. Some of you as parents right now, you're struggling with things that have nothing to do with your children, but you know how much that impacts us raising our kids. That's why it's so important that we want to get in today what we talked about in church today. What we talked about in church today was big. Dan was wrapping up Psalm 23. He's mining every bit of gold out of the sheep pasture that we're in. And we were in verses 5 and 6 today, and he was really leaning into these four things that he's offering us in times of just suffering, in times of when life gets hard, when you don't know what you did wrong, when you don't know what's going to happen next. And to jump right into it, he makes this turn here in this passage where he's my good shepherd, but he's moving towards, now he's your king, right? He used that language of, you see this turn, him being your king. So just on the front end, I would just ask you, before we get to the points, as parents, how did this sermon leave you? Because I think this is where we want it to leave us today. How did it leave you?
I think for me, it gave me just a place to rest. I mean, and that's really where the metaphor starts, right? That we're lying down in green pastures, and it's a place to rest, and I think it allows me to understand that God as my shepherd, that God, and we talked about God as a gardener a minute ago, but a slightly different metaphor, or a completely different metaphor. God is my shepherd. He is going to do the things that are best for me, even when I don't recognize that. He's going to set me in places where it is good for me, even if I don't understand why. He's going to protect me from things, even if I don't see them. and he's going to do all of that for my good. And for me, that's just a great place to just rest.
I know for me, I think the word, as you were asking that, the word that came to mind for me was hope. It just gave me hope, but for some of the same reasons. But because there are valleys, we've been talking about the valleys through this, and whether it's something going on between you and your child that is considered a valley, or whether it's something that's happening to your child outside of you that you're having to help parent them through a valley, those are really difficult. And to be perfectly honest, I would say as a parent, it's those times when you're watching your child go through a difficult and painful valley from external situations, that's more difficult for me than I think the valley that you sometimes have between you and your child, because that there's a lot more, for lack of a better word, there's a lot more control where that's between you and your child. There's some behaviors, there's some decisions, some humility, some repentance, some things that you guys can, have a lot more say over than external things. But regardless of what the situation is, I feel like this landed with a lot of hope that, he will provide, even, regardless of what's going on, he will provide. I mean, he provides that peace. And it's, I'm just looking back through all of the things he talked about, the persistent love, his eternal presence. And there's a lot of hope there to know that no matter what happens, good, bad, painful, exciting, that we have a good shepherd who is in charge and who nothing takes him by surprise, and who we can trust explicitly. We can trust.
Yeah. For me, where it really hit me, and this will lead us into the start of the conversation, is God's sovereignty in our suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you remove his sovereignty from our suffering, it's just nihilism, isn't it? But like when you see, no, he's still sovereign in it. And in that first passage where he says, you prepare that table for me in the presence of my enemies, that's a dope move. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, it's like, oh, you're my enemies. Sit here and eat a steak in front of them. Okay. Because what he's saying is like, even the two things, and then you anoint your head with oil, right? Meaning even though they're here, I've got this fragrant, calming perfume on me. The illustration Dan used was amazing with the sheep. Go listen to the sermon. I loved it. And it was kind of gross, but it was cool. But it's this whole idea that in the front of your enemy, which isn't just necessarily a person, it could be a situation. It could be something in your own head that you're struggling with. It could be a season. He's given us his perfect provision and his perfect peace. He's given us these things. And I think for me as a parent, sometimes I could be so caught up in the situation that I forget that there's provision, that it's right there. One time I was trying to start a fire in the backyard, and I was getting so frustrated because the stinking log wouldn't light. And my son, he comes, what about these pine cones? The pine cone's right in front of my face, but I can't get the log started but there's a pine cone and my little kid sees it. It's like sometimes we miss the provision because we're so focused on the problem.
Well, and I think the other illustration that Dan used was, Corrie ten Boom, being picked up, being arrested by the Nazis and put in the concentration camp, and there they are in the barracks where they were living was so infested with fleas that the soldiers wouldn't come in, and that gave them the freedom to worship, the freedom from being accosted by the soldiers while they were in that, by the prison guards while they were in that area. But they still had to deal with the fleas, right? And so, God's provision in one sense was also, it came with kind of a backsided cost, but the way she had described it was that provision was so much better. And so to be able to look at that situation and say, yeah, here's a thing that normally I would say, oh, my bed's infested with fleas, that's not a good thing. But in this case, that had in God's providence, in God's provision, that had a better result. And so, sometimes the thing that we think is bad, in the moment, and it might be in one circumstance, also causes or allows God to do something greater in our lives.
Man, that's a really good word. You look at the passage. When we think of Psalm 23, we think about this beautiful passage of God just taking care of us and providing for us. But you notice God's present, but who else is present in the passage?
The enemies are
The
present.
enemies. The enemies, it doesn't ever say he smites my enemies. He just says, no, in the face of them, I've given you what you need. Mm-hmm. And as you go through those struggles in parenting, like leaning into that is sometimes that's the best hope we have at the end of the day.
Yeah. Something that was really interesting that we got to experience today in a car ride home. So, one of our nieces is staying with us right now. She's come for an extended visit. And so she's here for a little over a month, and she was with us. And, our niece is an amazing, amazing young woman. And she has been through a lot, of medical trials in her life, that started with birth. And so she just, because of some trauma that happened at birth, I mean, she is highly visually impaired. And there's some other things that she struggles with. But she has had to live her whole life, she is legally blind, and, she uses a cane stick to help her, as she navigates walking. And we were talking on the way home, she has just loved this series. She's loved this series. And she was telling us, she said, I'm thankful for my disability. And she said, I wish that I could see like other people, but she said, my disability has helped me know that that God is, she says that in those valleys, she feels near to God and she feels close to him. And it's just interesting because, Dan was saying, last week, I know we're going back to last week, but if closeness to the shepherd is the goal, the valley is an advantage. And she was actually telling us that, like, my valley, it has been an advantage. And she said, it allows me to be able to talk to other people about hope and about Jesus and about him taking care and providing. And it was just interesting to see her perspective, because there's a constant valley or enemy that she, has to walk through every day. And she is able to see how God pulls her through and loves her and takes care of her. And she is full of hope. And
what a testimony, because a lot of times people who struggle, that's a way to say, if God was real, why would he let this happen? Mm-hmm. But the fact that she lives out Psalm 23, it actually goes to the next couple of things Dan was pointing to, because he also said, we see in this passage that the mercy and the goodness is with you, and God's going to be with you, not just his mercy and goodness. If just God's mercy and goodness is with you, that'd be enough. But then he's also with you. Like, right. Oh my gosh, it's just this idea that we have this persistent love and this presence that is, you can't run from it. It's very simple. I love the analogy from a sheep, because a sheep's you're not getting away. That's the purpose of the shepherd, right? The shepherd pulls you back. The shepherd goes and gets us, and his motivation for doing that is because of his love for this flock, for the sheep that he's got from birth. So, as a parent, there's seasons when, let's be honest, you just don't, it's hard, right? It's tough. Like, especially every time your child moves into a new area or a new life stage, because I just had the other thing figured out, and now we're here. Like my little son Calvin, he's 6, okay, or 5. And he came home the other day talking about a girlfriend. I'm like, dude, you are 5. Stop it. And I'm like, how do I navigate this? Like, I didn't think I was going to have that conversation with him at 5, So I think it's important for us to realize, like, he's persistent there in his love and in his grace and in his mercy. But another great warning that Dan gave us is all of this, the beauty of taking suffering. A band called King's Kaleidoscope writes this song, Beauty from Ashes. I love it because that's what God does, right? He creates beauty from ashes. There's another guy I guess he's kind of a heretic now, but he makes beautiful things out of the dust, But that's kind of the point, is God takes our tragedy and he turns it into triumph, right? But that is only available for those whose hope is in him. And I think at this time of the podcast, I just want to take just a quick minute as we kind of round it out today to say, we really do hope the things we discuss are beneficial. I think sitting down with you two, I learn so much every week. Selfishly, that's one of the reasons why I want to keep doing it, because I'm learning just from the conversations we have before that help generate these ideas that we're sharing. You know, all of it is meaningless without Christ. Right. Because all we're building is a moralistic platitude for you to what? Have more success in this life. The last thing we want is for any parent listening to this podcast to have well-behaved kids for the sake of well-behaved kids.
Right.
Because, you know, the path to hell is paved with well-behaved, well-intended things. What we want is genuine transformation through understanding that true life, true meaning, true transformation, true triumph, true joy, true hope, true peace, it all begins the moment our heart is placed into Jesus Christ and we receive his righteousness. I don't trust my kids' goodness as far as that juicy fruit gum flavor lasts. The zebra stripe one lasts like 30 seconds. I don't trust my kids' righteousness that long. I don't trust my righteousness that long. The reason of this podcast is not to help us build our righteousness. It's to help us clothe ourselves in Christ every single day. Mm-hmm. And that's how Dan really ended out this series. It's all meaningless. It's all purposeless apart from Christ. There's not one sermon that has any worth if it's not motivated by the gospel. It is just a more pious road to judgment. And our encouragement right now is your child is in church. We've been talking about having your child engage in church. When you listen to your sermons, I don't care if you go to Harmony, I don't care if you go to somewhere else. When you listen to your sermons, listen to them and then listen to them. Make sure your pastor is preaching back to the gospel and he's not preaching about how to go out into the secular world and be successful there. Please. That's the greatest hope we have. And we just want to take a minute in this podcast and just share the hope that's in the gospel, that we're all sinners. Jesus came to die for us. So if we believe in him, we have this beautiful lifestyle of repentance and beauty that flows out of us. You know, so many, it's not about rules. It's about the rules he's kept for us. And now we get the joy of being obedient and the joy of working that out. And here's the beautiful thought is, this is just from John. This is eternal life, meaning most fulfilling life, that we know him. That we know him. So our hope today is, like, if you're listening, that if you don't know him, that you would come to know him as your Savior. If your children don't know him and they're struggling with hurt or they're struggling with a bad habit, sure, pray for that bad habit, but pray for their salvation. It is greater for them to meet Jesus than to overcome a bad habit. So that being said, do you guys have any kind of final thoughts on today as we kind of wrap?
No, that's a fantastic way to end it. You know, seek him, and you'll find him. He's not that far from any of us.
Yeah. Be encouraged in the gospel. There is no greater hope. Listen, when you hear the gospel preached, if you're a Christian, don't tune out, because guess what? That is for you. That is grace for you to remind you of where he has you as well. And we're going to pray that this week over you and over your kids, that you will be encouraged in the completed work of Jesus. And we hope to see you next time. Hope you are living in harmony. My name's Delmar.
I'm Robert.
And I'm April.
Have a great rest of your day.